The rain hammered against the carriage windows like accusations Charlotte couldn't escape. She sat perfectly still, spine straight, hands folded in her lap the way her governess had taught her. The way a lady should sit, the way a commodity should present itself to its buyer. Because that's what she was now. A transaction, a bargaining chip in her father's desperate attempt to save the Beaumont name from ruin. They called him the Duke of Shadows, a man whose reputation could silence ballrooms with a single glance, a man no woman dared approach until her father signed her life away with a stroke of ink. Lady Charlotte Beaumont never asked to be brave, but when she stood before the most feared duke in all of England on their wedding night and spoke the words no one else dared, "I will not be another trophy in your collection," something shifted behind those cold grey eyes. He was supposed to be untouchable, unmovable, a fortress of ice and control, but she didn't know the rules, and when she challenged him, he lost control. This is the story of a marriage that began as a transaction and became something neither of them could walk away from. A story of power, pride, and the dangerous moment when two people who should never have met discover they can no longer live apart. If you want to discover how Charlotte breaks the unbreakable Duke, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. This story will stay with you long after it ends. The rain hammered against the carriage windows like accusations Charlotte couldn't escape. She sat perfectly still, spine straight, hands folded in her lap the way her governess had taught her. The way a lady should sit, the way a commodity should present itself to its buyer. Because that's what she was now. A transaction, a bargaining chip in her father's desperate attempt to save the Beaumont name from ruin. Her father sat across from her, his face grey in the dim light filtering through the rain-soaked glass. He hadn't looked at her once during the entire journey from London, hadn't spoken, except to bark orders at the driver when they'd stopped to change horses. Charlotte wanted to hate him. She tried to summon rage, indignation, the righteous fury she'd felt 3 days ago when he'd informed her, not asked, informed, that she would marry the Duke of Ashford before the week was out. But all she felt was numbness, a hollow space where her future used to be. The carriage lurched over a rut in the road, and her shoulder bumped against the velvet-lined wall. The pain was almost welcome, proof she could still feel something. "You will comport yourself with dignity," her father said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rhythm of the rain. "You will not embarrass me in front of the Duke." Charlotte's jaw tightened. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. "Of course, father." Her voice came out flat, lifeless, the voice of a woman already buried. He grunted, apparently satisfied, and returned his attention to the window, though Charlotte doubted he saw anything through the sheets of water streaming down the glass. She wondered what he'd traded for this marriage, what price the Duke of Shadows had demanded for taking a practically penniless bride, because everyone knew the Duke didn't need money. He had wealth that made kings jealous. Estates scattered across England like chess pieces on a board he controlled with ruthless precision. What he wanted, the rumours whispered, was control itself. Power. The satisfaction of owning things other men coveted. And somehow, her father had convinced him that Charlotte Beaumont, 22, unmarried, with nothing to her name but a pretty face and a failing family estate, was worth acquiring. The thought made her stomach turn. The carriage began to slow, and Charlotte's heart, which had been beating a steady, resigned rhythm, suddenly kicked against her ribs like a trapped bird. "We're here," her father said unnecessarily. Charlotte peered through the rain-blurred window and felt her breath catch. Ashford Manor rose from the landscape like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and towering spires, windows that gleamed like watching eyes. Even through the storm, it radiated power, permanence, the kind of wealth that had existed for centuries and would exist for centuries more. A shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The carriage stopped beneath a covered portico, and immediately a footman appeared with an umbrella, opening the door with practiced efficiency. Charlotte's father descended first, not bothering to offer her his hand. She gathered her skirts and stepped down onto rain-slicked stone, her kid leather boots barely making a sound. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something sharp and green like crushed herbs. The massive oak doors of the manor swung open, and a butler appeared, his expression perfectly neutral. "Lord Beaumont, Miss Beaumont, His Grace is expecting you in the study." Of course he was. The Duke of Shadows wouldn't be the type to greet guests in a drawing room like a normal person. He would summon them like subjects before a throne. Charlotte lifted her chin and followed her father into the entrance hall. She'd expected grandeur. She'd expected wealth. She hadn't expected beauty. The entrance hall soared 3 stories high, with a sweeping marble staircase that curved like a dancer's arm. Portraits lined the walls, centuries of Ashford ancestors staring down with varying degrees of judgment. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the grey light from the windows and scattering it across the floor in fractured rainbows. It was stunning and cold, so cold she could almost see her breath. The butler led them down a corridor lined with more portraits, more evidence of lineage and legacy. Charlotte's footsteps echoed on the polished floor, each click of her heels a countdown. They stopped before a door of dark mahogany, and the butler knocked once. "Enter." The voice that came from inside was deep, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command obedience. The door opened. Charlotte's father strode in without hesitation, but Charlotte found herself frozen on the threshold. The study was all dark wood and leather, shelves lined with books that looked actually read, not just displayed. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. And standing before that fire, one hand resting on the mantel as if he owned not just the house but the very concept of ownership itself, was the Duke of Ashford. Charlotte's breath stopped. She'd heard the descriptions. Everyone had. The Duke of Shadows, the Ice Duke, the man whose stare could freeze blood. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of him. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the seams of his perfectly tailored coat. His hair was dark, almost black, worn slightly longer than fashion dictated, as if he couldn't be bothered with trends. His face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from granite, a mouth that probably hadn't smiled in years. But it was his eyes that trapped her, grey. Not the soft grey of morning mist or the gentle grey of doves. This was the grey of storm clouds, of steel, of something ancient and unforgiving. And they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Lord Beaumont," the Duke said, his gaze never leaving Charlotte, "I see you've brought the merchandise." The words were like a slap, and Charlotte felt something hot and sharp flare beneath her breastbone. Her father laughed, actually laughed, as if the Duke had made a charming joke instead of reducing his daughter to an object. "Indeed, Your Grace. As promised, Charlotte is, well, you can see for yourself." The Duke's eyes travelled over her slowly, deliberately, not with lust. Charlotte had seen that look before, knew what it looked like when a man wanted her body. This was different. This was assessment, inventory, the way one might examine a horse before purchase. Charlotte felt something inside her begin to crack. She was supposed to curtsy, to lower her eyes demurely, to present herself as the perfect, biddable bride her father needed her to be. Instead, she met the Duke's gaze head-on and lifted her chin. For just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, something flickered in those grey eyes. Surprise, maybe, or perhaps annoyance that the merchandise dared to look back. "Miss Beaumont," the Duke said, and his voice was silk over steel. "Welcome to Ashford Manor. I trust you understand the terms of our arrangement." "I understand that I had no say in it," Charlotte heard herself reply. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Her father made a strangled sound. "Charlotte," but the Duke raised one hand, silencing him without even looking in his direction. "Honest," the Duke said slowly, those storm-grey eyes still locked on hers. "How refreshing." He moved away from the fireplace with the fluid grace of a predator, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. He towered over her, radiating a heat that seemed at odds with his reputation for coldness. Charlotte could smell him, sandalwood and something darker, like smoke and rain. "Honesty," he continued, his voice dropping to something almost intimate, "is a quality I value highly. So let me be equally honest with you, Miss Beaumont." He leaned down slightly, bringing his face level with hers. "You will marry me tomorrow. You will become the Duchess of Ashford. And in exchange, your father's debts will be paid, and your family name will remain intact. Charlotte's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. "What you will not do," he continued, each word precise and deliberate, "is cause me embarrassment. You will not gossip. You will not make scenes. You will present yourself as a credit to the Ashford name, and in return you will want for nothing." He straightened, putting distance between them again, and Charlotte felt like she could finally breathe. "Do we have an understanding, Miss Beaumont?" Every instinct screamed at her to nod, to agree, to take the path of least resistance and survive this transaction with whatever dignity she could salvage. But Charlotte looked at this man, this duke who thought he could buy her compliance along with her name, and felt that crack inside her widen into something like defiance. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "But I have one condition of my own." Her father gasped. The Duke's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "A condition," he repeated, and there was something dangerous in his tone now. Charlotte forced herself to hold his gaze. "I will not be invisible. I will not be another portrait on your wall, silent and still and easily ignored." She took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "If you want me to be your Duchess, then I will be a real person, with thoughts and opinions and the right to speak them." The silence that followed was absolute. Her father looked like he might faint. The Duke stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. And then slowly, so slowly Charlotte wondered if she was imagining it, one corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile, not quite, but something that might have been the ghost of one. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He turned away, returning to his position by the fire, and waved one hand dismissively. "The wedding is tomorrow at 10. Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your rooms. You may go." It was a dismissal, clear and final. But as Charlotte turned to leave, she heard his voice one more time. "Miss Beaumont." She looked back. The Duke was watching her again, and in the firelight, his eyes looked almost molten. "Do try not to make me regret this." Charlotte didn't know what possessed her. Shock, maybe. Or exhaustion. Or the reckless remnants of the girl she'd been before her life became a negotiation. "I could say the same to you, Your Grace." And with that, she swept from the room, leaving her stunned father and the Duke of Shadows behind. It wasn't until she was halfway up the stairs, following a stern-faced housekeeper to quarters she didn't want, that Charlotte realized her hands had finally stopped shaking. Not because she'd stopped being afraid, but because beneath the fear, something else had ignited. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. Charlotte didn't sleep. She lay in the massive four-poster bed, larger than her entire bedroom back at Beaumont House, and watched shadows dance across the ceiling as the fire in the hearth slowly died to embers. The room was beautiful, in the way mausoleums were beautiful, perfect, cold, untouched by anything as messy as actual life. The walls were papered in silk the color of champagne. The furniture was all dark mahogany, polished until it gleamed. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase on the escritoire, their perfume almost cloying in the stillness. Camera intima copia, text. It was a room designed to impress, not to comfort. Charlotte pulled the heavy brocade coverlet up to her chin, but it did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. Tomorrow, she would marry a man who looked at her like a chess piece. Tomorrow, she would become the Duchess of Ashford. Tomorrow, her life as Charlotte Beaumont would end and something else, something unknown and terrifying, would begin. She should be crying, should be raging against the injustice of it all. Instead, she kept seeing those grey eyes, that almost smile, the flicker of something, surprise, interest, when she dared to speak back to him. "Do try not to make me regret this." Charlotte rolled onto her side, staring at the dying fire. What had she been thinking? Challenging him like that? Making demands when she had no leverage, no power, nothing but a spine that apparently didn't know when to bend. Her father had been apoplectic in the carriage ride to the inn where they'd stayed the night. He'd ranted for 20 minutes about disrespect and ingratitude and throwing away opportunities. Charlotte had let the words wash over her like rain, inevitable and ultimately meaningless, because what was done was done. She'd shown her hand. revealed that she wouldn't be silent and decorative and easily managed. If the Duke wanted to break their arrangement because of it, then so be it. Except he hadn't. He'd dismissed her, yes, but he hadn't raged, hadn't threatened, hadn't done any of the things her father had done countless times when she dared to have an opinion. He just looked at her, like she was a puzzle he hadn't expected to find interesting. Charlotte pressed her palm against her chest, feeling her heart beating steady and strong beneath her nightgown. Whatever tomorrow brought, at least she'd go into it as herself, not as some false version crafted to please a man who'd purchased her like a painting for his collection. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost like freedom. Morning arrived with pale grey light and the sound of rain that hadn't stopped since she'd arrived. A maid appeared at 7, young with auburn hair and kind eyes that wouldn't quite meet Charlotte's. "Good morning, miss. I'm Annie. Mrs. Hartwell sent me to help you prepare." Charlotte sat up, pushing her hair back from her face. "Prepare for my execution, you mean?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Annie's eyes widened, and Charlotte immediately regretted her bitterness. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said softly. "That was unkind. You're just doing your job." Annie relaxed slightly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "That's all right, miss. I imagine if I were in your shoes, I'd feel the same." There was something in her tone, sympathy maybe, or understanding, that made Charlotte's throat tighten. "Have you worked at Ashford Manor long?" Charlotte asked as Annie moved to stoke the fire. 3 years, miss, since I was 15. "And the Duke?" Charlotte hesitated, not sure what she was asking. "What is he like as an employer?" Annie paused, poker still in hand, clearly weighing her words carefully. "He's fair, miss. Stern but fair. He doesn't tolerate laziness or dishonesty, but if you do your work proper, he leaves you be, and he pays better than most of the nobility. Never late with wages, and he makes sure the staff are fed well." It wasn't the answer Charlotte had expected. She'd anticipated stories of cruelty, of impossible demands, of the coldness everyone whispered about. "He's not unkind, then?" Annie turned, meeting Charlotte's eyes for the first time. "I won't lie to you, miss. His Grace is not warm. He doesn't smile, doesn't make small talk, but he's not cruel. There's a difference between cold and cruel, if you understand me." Charlotte nodded slowly. She did understand. She'd known cruel men, her father chief among them, men who took pleasure in others' pain, who wielded their power like weapons. Cold she could work with. Cold was just ice. And ice could melt. "Come, miss," Annie said gently. "We should get you ready. Mrs. Hartwell will have my head if you're late." The wedding dress had arrived at dawn. Charlotte stared at it where it hung against the wardrobe and felt her breath catch despite herself. It was exquisite, a masterpiece of white silk and Belgian lace, with tiny pearl buttons running down the back and sleeves that would fall just off her shoulders. The skirt was full without being ostentatious, elegant in its simplicity. Camera intima copia.txt. "His Grace commissioned it," Annie said quietly. "Had his modiste work through the night to have it ready." Charlotte's hand trembled as she reached out to touch the fabric. It was softer than anything she'd ever worn, softer than she'd thought silk could be. "He didn't even know my measurements," she whispered. "He has an eye for details, miss, always has." The thought made something flutter in Charlotte's chest. He'd looked at her once, just once, in his study, and somehow knew exactly what would fit. It was either impressive or deeply unsettling. Possibly both. Annie helped her dress with practiced efficiency, lacing the corset just tight enough to support the gown, fastening each tiny button with careful fingers. When she was done, she stepped back with a satisfied nod. "You look beautiful, miss." Charlotte turned to face the full-length mirror in the corner. She barely recognized herself. The dress transformed her from a frightened girl into something else, something that looked like it belonged in a manor like this, like it deserved to stand beside a duke. Her dark hair had been swept up with pearl pins, a few curls left to frame her face. Her skin looked porcelain against the white silk. Her eyes, usually a warm brown, looked almost amber in the morning light, bright with emotions she couldn't name. Camera intima copia, txt. She looked like a bride. She felt like an imposter. "It's time, miss," Annie said softly. Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. The chapel was attached to the manor by a covered walkway, a small mercy given the relentless rain. Charlotte walked alone. Her father was already inside, playing his role as the magnanimous patriarch giving his daughter away, as if he hadn't sold her to pay his gambling debts. Her hands were freezing despite the gloves, her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. She paused at the chapel doors, pressing one palm against the ancient oak to steady herself. This was it. The moment everything changed, the point of no return. "I will not be invisible," she'd told him. Charlotte took a breath that tasted like rain and roses, lifted her chin and pushed open the doors. The chapel was small and intimate, lit by hundreds of candles that turned the stone walls gold. There were no guests. This wasn't that kind of wedding. Just the vicar in his robes, her father standing awkwardly to one side, and the Duke. He stood before the altar in a black coat that fit him like sin, his white cravat the only brightness in the sea of darkness. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture military straight. And he was watching her with those storm-grey eyes, as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Charlotte's feet moved of their own accord, carrying her down the short aisle on legs that threatened to give out with every step. The candlelight caught the Duke's face, highlighting the sharp planes and angles, the intensity in his gaze that made her feel stripped bare despite the layers of silk and lace. She stopped beside him, and for a moment, just one suspended, crystalline moment, they simply looked at each other. Up close, she could see details she'd missed the day before. The faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw clenched and released as if he were holding back words, the fact that his eyes weren't just grey but had flecks of silver in them, like stars in a winter sky. "Miss Beaumont," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "You look acceptable." Acceptable. Charlotte felt a smile tug at her lips despite everything. High praise from the Duke of Shadows. Something flickered in his expression, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. "I don't give praise I don't mean." "Then I shall treasure the compliment, Your Grace." His eyebrow lifted a fraction of an inch. "Are you mocking me?" "Would I dare?" "I believe," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "that you would dare quite a lot." The vicar cleared his throat, and Charlotte realized they'd been staring at each other for far too long. Heat crept up her neck. "Shall we begin?" the vicar asked, clearly uncomfortable with the tension crackling in the air. The Duke inclined his head, and the ceremony started. Charlotte barely heard the words. Something about honor and obedience and joining together what God had wrought. Ancient promises that felt hollow in the candlelit chapel. When it came time for the vows, the Duke's voice was steady, certain, each word clear and deliberate as if he were signing a contract, which, Charlotte supposed, he was. Her own voice trembled only once, on the word obey. She saw the Duke's mouth twitch, though whether with amusement or annoyance she couldn't tell. "The ring," the vicar prompted. The Duke produced a band of gold so beautiful it stole Charlotte's breath. It was engraved with a pattern of vines and roses, delicate and intricate and clearly very, very old. He took her hand, the first time he'd touched her, and Charlotte felt electricity shoot up her arm. His hands were warm, large enough to engulf hers completely. Calloused in a way that surprised her. These weren't the soft hands of a man who did nothing but sign papers and attend balls. He slid the ring onto her finger with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she knew about him. It fit perfectly, of course it did. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar said, and Charlotte's stomach dropped. "You may kiss your bride, Your Grace." Oh God, she hadn't thought about this part. The Duke turned to face her fully, and Charlotte saw something shift in his expression. A question maybe, or a warning. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, she realized. Charlotte tilted her face up. Their lips met, and the world stopped. It wasn't passionate. It wasn't deep, just a brush of mouth against mouth, soft and brief and utterly devastating in its tenderness. Charlotte's eyes fluttered closed, and for just that heartbeat of contact, she forgot everything. The arrangement, the transaction, the fear. All that existed was warmth and the faint taste of mint and the impossible softness of his lips against hers. And then, it was over. The Duke pulled back, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Duchess," he said, and the words sounded like both a greeting and a possession. Charlotte's knees felt weak. "Duke." His mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if he remembered how. "Welcome," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear, "to the rest of your life." There was no wedding breakfast, no gathering of well-wishers, no toasts with champagne, no cake decorated with sugar roses and good wishes. Charlotte stood in the entrance hall of Ashford Manor, still wearing her wedding dress, watching her father's carriage disappear down the rain-soaked drive through the front windows. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't offered congratulations or paternal advice, or even a stiff embrace. He'd simply collected his payment, whatever arrangement he'd made with the Duke, and left. Charlotte was alone. Well, not alone. She could feel the Duke's presence behind her like a physical weight. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the chapel, hadn't touched her beyond that devastating kiss that still tingled on her lips. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged. "Your father was eager to depart," the Duke said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Charlotte didn't turn around. He got what he came for. And what was that, precisely? Freedom from his debts, and freedom from me. She heard the Duke move closer, his footsteps barely audible on the marble floor. "Did he hurt you?" The question was so unexpected that Charlotte did turn then, finding the Duke closer than she'd anticipated, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched as if he were bracing for her answer. "Not physically," Charlotte said quietly. "My father's cruelty was always more refined than that." Something dark flickered across the Duke's face. "I see." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle, so at odds with everything she'd heard about the Duke of Shadows, that Charlotte's breath caught. "You're my Duchess now," he said, his voice low and intense, "which means you're under my protection. No one, not your father, not anyone, will hurt you again, refined or otherwise." Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest. "Why? Why what? Why do you care? I'm just the merchandise you purchased." The Duke's expression hardened. He dropped his hand from her face and stepped back, and Charlotte immediately mourned the loss of his warmth. "Is that what you think?" His voice had gone cold again, that ice she'd expected from the beginning sliding back into place like armor. "That I see you as an object? You called me that yourself. Yesterday, in your study. I was testing you." Charlotte blinked. "Testing me? To see if you had any fire in you, any spine?" His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You passed. Spectacularly, I might add." Charlotte stared at him, trying to reconcile this with the man she'd thought she was marrying. "I don't understand you." "Good," the Duke said, and this time it was definitely a smile, small and sharp and somehow sad. "I'd be disappointed if you did. After all, we've known each other less than 2 days." He offered his arm, the gesture formal and courteous. "Come. Mrs. Hartwell has prepared a light luncheon. You must be hungry." Charlotte wasn't hungry. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety and confusion, and something else she couldn't name. But she placed her hand on his arm anyway, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fine wool of his coat. They walked through the manor in silence, and Charlotte found herself studying the Duke from the corner of her eye. He was impossibly tall, forcing her to look up even when they were standing side by side. His profile was all sharp edges, nose, jaw, cheekbones that could cut glass. But there was something almost beautiful about the severity of it, like a blade honed to perfection. And his hands. She kept noticing his hands. They were large and scarred in places, the hands of a man who'd done more than sign papers and attend balls. She wanted to ask about those scars. Wanted to know what had put that thin white line across his knuckles, what had caused the mark just below his left thumb. But she didn't, because they were strangers. Strangers who happened to be married. The thought made her dizzy. The dining room was smaller than Charlotte had expected, intimate almost, with windows that overlooked a garden currently being battered by rain. The table could seat 20, but had been set for 2, the places positioned at one end so they wouldn't have to shout across mahogany to be heard. The Duke pulled out her chair, and Charlotte sat, hyper-aware of his hands near her shoulders, the heat of him at her back. Servants appeared with silent efficiency, placing dishes before them. Cold pheasant, bread still warm from the oven, cheese, fruit, wine that glowed ruby red in crystal glasses. Charlotte picked up her fork and tried to eat, but every bite tasted like sawdust. "You're not eating," the Duke observed. "I'm not hungry." "You need to eat something. You've had nothing since yesterday." Charlotte set down her fork with more force than necessary. "With all due respect, Your Grace, you may have purchased my name and my future, but you do not get to dictate what I put in my mouth." The silence that followed was deafening, and then, impossibly, the Duke laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, just a short burst of sound that seemed to surprise him, as much as it surprised Charlotte, but it transformed his face completely, softening the harsh lines, making him look younger, almost approachable. "There's that fire again," he said, shaking his head. "You truly have no sense of self-preservation, do you? Should I be afraid of you?" The Duke's smile faded. He set down his wineglass and looked at her with those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "No," he said quietly. "You should never be afraid of me, Charlotte." It was the first time he'd used her given name. It sounded different in his voice, softer somehow despite the natural gravel in his tone. "Then why does everyone else fear you?" "Because I've given them reason to." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I'm not a good man, Charlotte. I've done things—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "I've done things that would horrify you. I've made enemies, powerful enemies, which is why you need to understand that as my wife, you are now a target." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "A target for what?" "For anyone who wants to hurt me, and there are many who do." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Rain streaked the glass, distorting his reflection. "I should have thought of that before I agreed to this marriage. Should have considered that I was putting you in danger just by giving you my name." Charlotte rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him at the window. Up close, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. "What exactly did my father tell you about me?" she asked quietly. The Duke glanced at her sidelong. "That you were biddable, quiet, obedient, that you would cause me no trouble and ask for nothing." Charlotte couldn't help it. She laughed. It came out bitter and sharp. "Then I'm afraid you've been severely misled, Your Grace." "Alexander," Charlotte blinked. "What?" "My name is Alexander, and given that we're married, I think you can dispense with the formality." His mouth quirked. "At least when we're alone." "Alexander," Charlotte repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It suited him, strong, classic, with just a hint of something ancient and powerful. "Better," he said, and there was approval in his voice that made warmth bloom in Charlotte's chest. They stood together at the window, watching the rain, and for a moment the silence between them felt almost comfortable. "I won't be biddable," Charlotte said finally, "or obedient, and I will most certainly cause you trouble. I'm counting on it." She looked up at him, confused. "You want me to cause trouble? I want you to be yourself." He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze stole her breath. "Whatever that is, however inconvenient it might be. Because I didn't marry you to have a beautiful statue standing in my house. I married you because—" He stopped abruptly, as if he'd said more than he intended. "Because why?" Charlotte pressed. But the shutters had come down again, that careful control sliding back into place. "Because it was advantageous. For both of us. It shouldn't have hurt. It was the truth, after all. This was a transaction, an arrangement. But it did hurt, more than Charlotte wanted to admit. She stepped back, putting distance between them. "Of course. How foolish of me to think otherwise. Charlotte, if you'll excuse me, Your Grace, I'd like to rest. It's been a very long day." She didn't wait for his permission, just swept from the room with as much dignity as she could muster, leaving him standing alone by the window. It wasn't until she was halfway up the grand staircase that she heard him call after her. "Charlotte." She stopped but didn't turn around. "Your rooms adjoin mine. There's a connecting door." Her heart kicked into her throat. Of course there was. They were married. There would be expectations, duties, the wedding night, oh God. She'd been so focused on the ceremony itself that she hadn't let herself think about what came after. "The door has a lock," Alexander continued, his voice floating up the staircase. "On your side. Use it if you wish. I won't come to you until you're ready." Charlotte's hand gripped the banister so hard her knuckles went white. She turned slowly to look down at him. He stood at the base of the stairs, hands in his pockets, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't read. "And if I'm never ready?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something painful flickered across his face. "Then the door stays locked. I told you, Charlotte, I'm many things, but I'm not a monster." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor, leaving Charlotte standing alone on the stairs with her heart in her throat and questions burning behind her eyes. Charlotte's rooms were exactly as she'd left them that morning, beautiful, cold, impersonal. But now there was a door. It was set into the wall opposite her bed, made of the same dark wood as everything else in the manor. Brass hinges, a brass lock that glinted in the fading afternoon light. Charlotte crossed the room slowly and placed her palm against the wood. She could hear movement on the other side. Footsteps, the low murmur of a male voice, Alexander's, speaking to someone. A valet, probably. Her husband was on the other side of this door, the man who'd kissed her with unexpected gentleness, who'd laughed at her defiance, who'd promised protection and then admitted he was putting her in danger just by marrying her. The man who'd given her a lock and told her to use it. Charlotte's hand moved to the key, turning it slowly until she heard the click of the bolt sliding home. She waited, heart pounding, for a knock, for Alexander to test the door, to demand entry, to exercise his rights as her husband. But there was nothing, just silence from the other side of the door. Charlotte pressed her forehead against the wood and closed her eyes. What was she doing? What had she gotten herself into? She should be terrified, should be planning her escape, counting the days until she could annul this disaster of a marriage and return to what? Her father's house? Where she was nothing but a burden and a disappointment. At least here, in this beautiful prison, she was something. The Duchess of Ashford. A woman with a name, a title, a room of her own with a lock on the door. It wasn't freedom, but it was more than she'd had before. Charlotte changed out of her wedding dress with shaking hands, hanging it carefully in the wardrobe. She pulled on a nightgown, soft cotton that felt like heaven after the constriction of silk and corset, and climbed into bed. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed against the windows. Charlotte lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the manor settling around her. Footsteps in distant corridors, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, and from the other side of the locked door, nothing. Her husband, the Duke of Shadows, honoring his word. Charlotte closed her eyes and tried to sleep, ignoring the small, traitorous part of her heart that wondered what would have happened if she'd left the door unlocked. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Charlotte woke to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten to curtain, turning her room into a box of golden light that made her squint and burrow deeper into the covers. For one blissful moment, she forgot where she was. And then reality crashed over her like ice water. She was married. She was the Duchess of Ashford. She was lying in a bed in a manor that was now supposedly her home, with a husband on the other side of a locked door who she barely knew and didn't understand. Charlotte groaned and pulled a pillow over her face. A knock at her door made her shoot upright, heart racing. But it wasn't the connecting door, it was the main door, the one leading to the corridor. "Come in," Charlotte called, her voice rough with sleep. Annie entered with a tea tray, her expression carefully cheerful. "Good morning, Your Grace." Your Grace. Charlotte would never get used to that. "Good morning, Annie." The maid set the tray on the small table by the window and began pulling back the heavy curtains, flooding the room with even more light. "His Grace asked me to inform you that breakfast will be served in the morning room at 9, if you wish to join him. But if you'd prefer to eat here, I can bring you a tray." Charlotte glanced at the clock on the mantel. 8:30. Which meant she had 30 minutes to decide whether to face her husband or hide in her room like a coward. She thought of the way he'd looked at her yesterday, the gentleness in his touch, the promise of protection. And then she thought of the locked door between them. "I'll join him," Charlotte heard herself say. Annie's smile was approving. "Very good, Your Grace. Shall I help you dress?" 20 minutes later, Charlotte stood before her mirror in a morning dress of pale blue muslin, her hair swept up in a simple style that Annie had somehow made look elegant. She looked like a duchess, poised, proper, put together. She felt like a fraud. Charlotte took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made her way downstairs. The morning room was exactly what its name implied, a room designed to catch the morning sun, with windows facing east and furniture upholstered in cheerful yellows and whites that seemed at odds with the rest of the manor's Gothic grandeur. Alexander was already there, seated at a small round table with a newspaper spread before him and a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up when Charlotte entered, and something shifted in his expression, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. "Good morning," he said, rising with the automatic courtesy of his class. "I hope you slept well." It was such a normal thing to say, such a husband thing to say, as if they were any ordinary married couple and not two strangers bound by contract and circumstance. "Well enough," Charlotte lied, taking the seat across from him. "And you?" "I've had worse nights." A servant materialized to pour Charlotte tea. She hadn't even had to ask, and place a plate before her with perfectly prepared eggs, toast, and kippers. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the rustle of Alexander's newspaper and the clink of silverware against china. It should have been uncomfortable, it was certainly awkward, but there was something almost companionable about it too, as if they were practicing at being married. "I thought we might discuss the household today," Alexander said, folding his newspaper and setting it aside. "Mrs. Hartwell is eager to hand over the keys to you." Charlotte nearly choked on her tea. "Hand over the keys? You're the Duchess now. The household is your domain." "But I'm not prepared to—" "Breathe, Charlotte." She did, dragging air into lungs that had forgotten how to work. Alexander was watching her with something that might have been amusement. "Mrs. Hartwell will help you. She's been running Ashford Manor for 15 years. She knows everything there is to know about managing an estate this size. You won't be alone." "But why would she listen to me? I'm nobody. I don't even know how many servants there are here or what their duties are or—" "She'll listen to you because you're my wife, because I've told her to, and because—" He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Because I think you're more capable than you give yourself credit for." Charlotte stared at him. "You don't know me well enough to make that assessment. I know you stood up to me, in my own study, when your father was ready to sell you to the highest bidder, and you had every reason to simply accept your fate quietly." He leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intent on hers. "I know you demanded to be treated as a person, not a possession. That takes courage, Charlotte, and intelligence, both of which are required to run a household like this." Heat crept up Charlotte's neck. It wasn't desire, not exactly, but something close to it, the warmth of being seen, of being acknowledged as something more than decorative. "I'll try," she said quietly. "I can't promise I'll be good at it, but I'll try. That's all I ask." They returned to their breakfast, but the silence felt different now, less awkward, more like the beginning of something. "Alexander," Charlotte said suddenly, surprising herself. He looked up, one eyebrow raised in question. "Yesterday you said I was in danger, because of your enemies." She set down her teacup with a hand that was almost steady. "I think I deserve to know what I'm up against, who these enemies are, what they might do." Something dark crossed his face. For a moment Charlotte thought he would refuse, would shut down the conversation and retreat behind that wall of ice. But then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair, mussing it in a way that made him look younger, more human. "You're right," he said. "You do deserve to know. But it's not a conversation for the breakfast table." "Then where?" "My study, after you've met with Mrs. Hartwell. There are things I need to tell you. Things about—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "Things about who I am, what I've done. And once I've told you, you may decide you want that door between our rooms to stay locked permanently." Charlotte's heart kicked into a faster rhythm. "Are you trying to frighten me?" "No, I'm trying to be honest with you. as you were honest with me." He stood, coming around the table to stand beside her chair. Charlotte had to tilt her head back to look up at him, and the sheer size of him, the physical power he represented, should have been intimidating. But when he extended his hand to her, it was an offer, not a demand. "Will you trust me, Charlotte, just for a few hours, meet with Mrs. Hartwell, learn about your new home, and then come to my study and let me tell you the truth?" Charlotte looked at his hand, scarred, strong, steady, and then up at his face. In the morning light, his eyes looked less like steel and more like smoke. There were shadows under them, as if he hadn't slept well either. And something in his expression, a vulnerability he was trying to hide, made her chest ache. This man, this Duke of Shadows who everyone feared, who'd given her a lock on her door and praised her courage, and was now asking for her trust instead of demanding it. Charlotte placed her hand in his and let him pull her to her feet. "All right," she said. "I'll trust you, for now." His fingers tightened around hers for just a moment, warm and solid and real. "Thank you," he murmured. And then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, "You have no idea what that means to me." Mrs. Hartwell turned out to be a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She was also, Charlotte discovered, surprisingly kind. "Welcome, Your Grace," she said, leading Charlotte through the manor with brisk efficiency. "His Grace has informed me that you'll be taking over management of the household. So I'm here to help make that transition as smooth as possible." For the next 2 hours, Charlotte's head spun with information. There were 37 servants at Ashford Manor, 37 people whose wages, schedules, duties, and personal dramas she was now supposedly responsible for. There were menus to approve, supplies to order, accounts to review. There was the wine cellar to inventory, the linen closet to manage, the guest rooms to keep ready even though Alexander apparently never entertained. It was overwhelming, impossible. A job that required skills Charlotte had never been taught because her father had kept her isolated and undereducated, useful only as a pretty face to trade for his debts. And yet, as Mrs. Hartwell explained the household systems, the careful organization, the schedules, the way everything ran like clockwork, Charlotte felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Interest. And beneath that, excitement. This wasn't just a manor. It was a small kingdom, a complex machine that required intelligence and attention and care to keep running smoothly. And Alexander had given it to her, trusted her with it. "You're doing very well, Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell said as they finished touring the kitchens. There was approval in her tone that made Charlotte stand a little straighter. Most new brides find all this rather overwhelming. "I am overwhelmed," Charlotte admitted. "But I'm also curious. Is that strange?" Mrs. Hartwell's severe expression softened into something that might have been a smile. "Not strange at all. His Grace said you were intelligent. I see he was correct." Charlotte felt warmth bloom in her chest. Alexander had said that? About her? "Mrs. Hartwell," Charlotte said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Grace." What was she like? His first wife? The question hung in the air between them. Charlotte watched emotions flicker across the housekeeper's face, surprise, discomfort, and then something like pity. "His Grace has never been married before, Your Grace." Charlotte blinked. "But I thought, everyone says he's so cold, so closed off. I assumed he'd been hurt, that he'd loved someone and lost them." "No," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. "His Grace's coldness comes from a different source entirely, but it's not my place to speak of it. If you want to understand His Grace, you'll have to ask him yourself." Which, Charlotte realized, was exactly what she was about to do. Alexander's study was exactly as Charlotte remembered, all dark wood and leather, books and firelight. But now she saw details she'd missed before. The way the books were organized by subject, not just for show. The papers on his desk arranged in precise stacks, the small imperfections, a crack in the leather of his chair, a water ring on the side table, that spoke of actual use. This was a room where someone worked, where someone lived. Alexander stood when she entered, and Charlotte noticed he'd removed his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were far more muscular than she'd expected, corded with strength and marked with more of those intriguing scars. "Charlotte," he said, and there was something in his voice, nervousness that she'd never heard before. "Thank you for coming. You asked me to trust you. I'm here." He gestured to one of the chairs before the fire. "Sit, please. This might take a while." Charlotte sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Alexander remained standing, pacing to the window and back, clearly gathering his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "What do you know about the war?" he asked. Charlotte blinked at the apparent non sequitur. "The war with France, it's been going on for years. We're winning, I think. But I'm afraid my father didn't believe women needed to concern themselves with politics." "Of course he didn't." Alexander's voice was bitter. "Well, allow me to educate you, wife. The war with Napoleon is indeed nearly over. We are winning. And one of the reasons we're winning is because of men like me." He turned to face her, and in the firelight, his expression was stark, haunted. "I'm a spy, Charlotte. Or I was. For the last 8 years I've worked for the Crown, gathering intelligence, disrupting French operations, doing things that—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "Doing things that were necessary, but not noble, not clean, not anything you'd find in the romantic tales of heroism." Charlotte's heart was pounding. "What kind of things?" "The kind I can't tell you about. Not all of them. But you need to understand that I've made powerful enemies, men who would very much like to see me dead. And now that I have a wife," his voice roughened, "now they have a way to hurt me that doesn't require getting past my guards or poisoning my wine." Understanding crashed over Charlotte like a wave. "They could hurt you by hurting me." "Yes. That's why you married me. Not for the usual reasons, heirs, alliances, money. You married me because—" She stopped, pieces clicking into place. "You married me to keep me safe." Alexander's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Is that what you think? Isn't it? My father owed someone money. Dangerous people, probably. You paid his debts and took me as payment, which means those dangerous people have no reason to come after me. And by giving me your name and your protection, you ensured that anyone who tries to hurt me is making an enemy of you." Charlotte stood, moving closer to him. "That's it, isn't it? This marriage. It's not about you acquiring property or satisfying lust, or any of the things marriages usually are. It's about protection." Alexander stared at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked utterly stunned. "How did you—" "Because it's the only thing that makes sense. You don't need my money, you have plenty. You don't need my connections, my father has none worth having. And you could have any woman you wanted if all you needed was someone to warm your bed. But what you needed was someone you could protect, someone who would be safer with your name than without it." She was standing right in front of him now, close enough to see the rapid pulse at his throat, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. "Whose daughter am I really, Alexander? What did my father do that put me in so much danger that marrying the Duke of Shadows was the safer option?" Alexander's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them they were full of something that looked like pain. "Your father gambled with the wrong people, made deals with French sympathizers, got in so deep that when they demanded payment and he couldn't provide it, they told him they'd take you instead. Not as payment, as leverage. To use against—" He stopped. "Against you," Charlotte finished, the pieces finally falling into place. "They were going to take me to use against you, which means my father knew about your work, about what you do for the Crown." "How?" "Because I made a mistake 3 years ago, used him as an unwitting asset, passed information through him without his knowledge, but someone found out, put the pieces together, realized that Lord Beaumont had access to certain networks, certain information, and they've been watching him ever since." Alexander's voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way of men reciting unforgivable truths. "When your father's debts came due and he couldn't pay, they saw an opportunity. They knew I'd been using him, knew I'd feel responsible for putting him and you in danger. So they told him exactly what they'd do to his daughter if he didn't surrender you to them." Charlotte's blood ran cold. What would they have done? Nothing good. Nothing you need details about. Just know that death would have been a mercy compared to what they had planned. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were twin storms of grief and rage and guilt. "So, yes, Charlotte, I married you to keep you safe. I married you because it was my fault you were in danger in the first place. I married you because the thought of what they would do to you if I didn't—" His voice broke. "I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." Charlotte's hand moved of its own accord, reaching up to touch his face. He flinched at the contact as if he didn't deserve gentleness. "You saved me," she whispered. "I endangered you first." "You saved me," she repeated more firmly, "and you gave me a choice. You could have forced this marriage, could have treated me as property the way everyone expected, but you didn't. You gave me a lock on my door. You asked for my trust instead of demanding it. You're trying to protect me even now by telling me the truth instead of letting me live in ignorance." She stepped closer, and Alexander's breath caught. "So yes, I'm in danger. Yes, this marriage is built on necessity rather than affection. But you know what, Alexander? I'd rather be here with you knowing the truth than anywhere else living a lie." "You don't know what you're saying," he said roughly. "You don't know what being married to me really means." "Then show me," Charlotte challenged. "Show me what it means to be your duchess, your partner. Not your possession or your burden, but your equal." Something in Alexander's expression cracked. He raised one hand slowly, cupping her face with a gentleness that belied his size. "You're extraordinary," he murmured. "Terrifying and extraordinary." "Is that a compliment?" "The highest I know how to give." And then, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. Not like at the altar, brief and chaste and performative. This was real, deep, a kiss that tasted like confession and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Charlotte's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Alexander made a sound low in his throat, half groan, half surrender. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander pressed his forehead to hers. "The door," he said, his voice ragged. "The lock. What about it?" "Don't use it." "Not tonight. Let me—" He swallowed hard. "Let me prove to you that I can be what you need, not just a protector, but a husband." Charlotte's heart was thundering so hard she could barely hear over the sound of it. But she looked into those storm-grey eyes and saw vulnerability there, raw and real. "All right," she whispered. "No lock tonight." Alexander's eyes fluttered closed, and the relief on his face was devastating. "Thank you," he breathed. And then, quieter, "Thank you for trusting me." "I swear I won't waste that trust." Charlotte believed him. God help her, but she believed him. Chapter 5. The night. Everything changed. Charlotte spent the rest of the day in a daze. She took dinner in her room, not because she was avoiding Alexander, but because Mrs. Hartwell suggested it might be wise to rest before whatever came next. The older woman hadn't said the words, but Charlotte understood. This would be her wedding night. The moment when this marriage became real in every sense of the word. Annie helped her bathe in water, scented with lavender and rose petals, helped her into a nightgown far finer than anything Charlotte had ever worn, white silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, modest yet somehow devastating in its simplicity. "You look beautiful, Your Grace," Annie said softly, brushing Charlotte's hair until it shone like mahogany silk down her back. Charlotte stared at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked like someone brave, someone ready. She felt like a girl pretending at adulthood, one heartbeat away from panic. "Annie," Charlotte said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Grace." "What if I'm not ready? What if I disappoint him?" Annie's hands stilled in Charlotte's hair. For a moment, silence hung between them. But then Annie met her eyes in the mirror, and her expression was kind. "Your Grace. His Grace is not the kind of man who would demand what you're not ready to give. He's stern, yes, but he's not cruel. If you need time, tell him. He'll listen." Charlotte nodded, throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. Annie finished with her hair and stepped back. "Is there anything else you need, Your Grace?" "Courage," Charlotte said with a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You already have that, Your Grace, more than you know." And then Annie was gone and Charlotte was alone with her racing heart and the door. The unlocked door. Charlotte moved to it slowly, pressing her palm against the wood the way she had last night. But this time she didn't turn the key. This time she left the lock untouched and stepped back, waiting. The knock came at 10 o'clock exactly. 3 soft raps against the door. A question, not a demand. Charlotte's voice barely worked. "Come in." The door opened slowly and Alexander stepped through. He'd changed out of his formal attire into a simple white shirt and dark trousers, his feet bare against the carpet. Without his jacket and cravat, he looked less like a duke and more like a man, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that softened the sharp angles of his face. His eyes found hers across the room, and Charlotte saw everything she was feeling reflected back at her. Nervousness, hope, a vulnerability that made her chest ache. "Charlotte," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "Are you certain about this? Because if you've changed your mind, if you need more time—" "I haven't," Charlotte interrupted. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I told you I'd trust you. I meant it." Alexander crossed the room slowly, stopping just in front of her. Up close, Charlotte could see the rapid pulse at his throat, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. He was nervous too, she realized. This powerful man who'd faced danger countless times, he was nervous about this moment with her. The realization steadied her. Charlotte reached up and placed her hand over his heart, feeling it thunder against her palm. "Breathe, Alexander," she said, echoing his words from the breakfast table that morning. He did, dragging in air like a drowning man. And then, so slowly it felt like an eternity, he raised his hands to frame her face with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "You're beautiful," he murmured. "I don't think I told you that. At the wedding. You were so beautiful, it hurt to look at you." Charlotte felt warmth bloom in her cheeks. "You told me I looked acceptable. I lied." His thumb brushed her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. "I was terrified, Charlotte. Standing in that chapel, watching you walk toward me, knowing that you deserved so much better than a man like me." "Stop," Charlotte whispered. "Stop thinking you're not worthy. You saved me, Alexander. You gave me a choice when I'd never had one. You gave me a voice. You always had a voice. I just made sure people had to listen." Charlotte smiled despite the tears threatening to spill. "Then show me who you really are. Not the Duke of Shadows, just Alexander, just the man I married." Something in his expression cracked wide open. He leaned down and kissed her, softly at first, a question rather than a demand. Charlotte answered by rising on her toes, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and Charlotte felt the world fade away. There was only this moment. Only Alexander. Only the warmth spreading through her chest like sunrise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander pressed his forehead to hers. "If at any moment you need me to stop," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you're afraid or uncomfortable or—" "I know," Charlotte said. "I know you'll stop. That's why I'm not afraid." Alexander's eyes closed briefly, as if her words had physically moved him. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "You do, and I'm choosing you, right now, freely." He kissed her again, and this time Charlotte felt all his carefully maintained control begin to crack. Felt the years of loneliness and isolation in the way he held her, as if she were the only real thing in a world full of shadows. The candles flickered on the mantel, casting dancing light across the walls. Outside, rain began to fall again, a soft patter against the windows that cocooned them in their own private world. "Charlotte," Alexander breathed against her hair. "My Charlotte." "Yours," she agreed. "And you're mine." He drew back just enough to look at her, and the expression on his face, wonder and tenderness and something that looked like worship, stole her breath. "Always," he promised. And then there were no more words. Just the quiet rustle of fabric, the dying crackle of the fire, the whisper of rain against glass, just two people who'd found each other in the darkness, learning what it meant to no longer be alone. The candles had burned to stubs by the time Charlotte opened her eyes. She didn't remember falling asleep, didn't remember the exact moment when nervousness had transformed into trust, and trust into something infinitely deeper. But she woke to soft grey light filtering through the curtains, and Alexander's arms wrapped protectively around her, his steady heartbeat beneath her ear the most comforting sound she'd ever heard. Charlotte shifted slightly, and Alexander's arms tightened instinctively, even in sleep. She studied his face in the dawn light, the sharp angles softened by sleep, the lines of tension smoothed away. He looked younger like this, peaceful, like a man who'd finally found something worth holding on to. Charlotte's chest ached with the enormity of what she felt. Love. She loved this impossible man, this spy who'd become a savior, this duke who'd given her freedom instead of a cage. As if sensing her gaze, Alexander's eyes fluttered open. For a moment he looked disoriented, and then his eyes found hers and he smiled. It was a real smile, unguarded, beautiful. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone as if reassuring himself she was real. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Charlotte understood what he was really asking, whether he'd hurt her, whether she regretted anything about the night before. She caught his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "I'm perfect," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Relief flooded Alexander's expression. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me, for choosing me, for being brave enough to unlock that door." Charlotte smiled against his shoulder. "Thank you for being the kind of man worth unlocking it for." They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the rain wrapped in each other and the quiet knowledge that something fundamental had shifted between them. "Charlotte," Alexander said softly. "I know this marriage started as an arrangement, a transaction born of necessity rather than choice." He paused, and Charlotte felt his heartbeat quicken beneath her ear. "But somewhere between our wedding and this moment, you stopped being an obligation and became—" He stopped, and Charlotte could feel him searching for the right words. "Became what?" she prompted gently. "Everything," Alexander breathed. "You became my everything." Charlotte's heart swelled. She pushed herself up to look at him properly, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that he'd said too much too soon. "You're my everything too," she whispered. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe when you gave me that lock. Maybe when you told me the truth about who you are. Maybe last night, when you showed me what tenderness looks like. But somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Alexander's eyes widened, his breath catching. "Say that again." "I love you, Alexander." The smile that broke across his face was like watching ice melt in spring. Slow, inevitable, transformative. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "God, Charlotte, I love you so much it terrifies me." He pulled her down for a kiss that was sweet and deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, Charlotte settled back against his chest with a contented sigh. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now?" Alexander's arms tightened around her. "Now we build a life together. A real marriage. Not an arrangement or a transaction, but a partnership. I'd like that. So would I." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I warn you, I'm going to be insufferable about your safety. You've become far too precious to risk." Charlotte laughed. "I can live with insufferable, as long as you can live with me being stubborn and opinionated and refusing to be ornamental." "I'm counting on it," Alexander said, and the warmth in his voice made Charlotte's heart sing. They lay together as the rain continued to fall and the grey morning light slowly brightened to pale gold. Outside, the world went on as it always had, but inside this room everything had changed. Two strangers brought together by circumstance had become something neither expected. Partners, confidants, lovers in the truest sense, not just of body, but of soul. Charlotte closed her eyes and listened to Alexander's heartbeat, steady and strong and real. This was what freedom felt like, she realized. Not the absence of commitment, but the presence of choice. The knowledge that she'd chosen this man, and he'd chosen her back. Freely, completely, forever. "Charlotte," Alexander murmured. "Yes? Stay with me. Not just this morning, but always. Build this life with me. Be my partner in everything." Charlotte smiled against his chest. "Always," she promised. "In everything." And as Alexander held her close and the rain washed the world clean outside their windows, Charlotte knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. In the arms of the man she loved. Finally, gloriously home. Charlotte woke to an empty bed. For one horrible moment, panic seized her chest. Had last night been a dream? Had Alexander regretted it, regretted her, and fled back to his own room? But then she saw the note on the pillow beside her, written in a strong, angular hand, called away on urgent business. "I'll be back by noon. Lock the door behind me." Charlotte sat up, clutching the note to her chest. The sheets beside her were cold, which meant he'd been gone for hours, but he'd left a note. He'd thought of her, even in whatever crisis had called him away, and he'd signed it just A, not Your Grace, or Ashford, or even Alexander. Just A. Something intimate and personal that made her heart skip. Charlotte rose and went through her morning routine in a daze, her body pleasantly sore in ways that made her blush. Annie appeared with breakfast and helped her dress, but if the maid noticed anything different about her mistress, she was too well trained to comment. By 10 o'clock, Charlotte was dressed in a morning gown of soft green and making her way downstairs to meet with Mrs. Hartwell about the weekly menus. She was halfway across the entrance hall when the front door burst open. Charlotte spun, expecting to see Alexander returned early. Instead, a stranger stood in the doorway. He was tall, not as tall as Alexander, but close, with fair hair and cold blue eyes that raked over Charlotte with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Well," the stranger said, his voice cultured and cruel, "you must be the new Duchess." Charlotte's hand moved instinctively to her throat. "Who are you? How did you get in here? Your butler is currently indisposed. Don't worry, he'll live. Probably." The stranger stepped fully into the hall and closed the door behind him with an ominous click. "As for who I am, that's not really important. What's important is that I have a message for your husband." Terror flooded Charlotte's veins, but she forced herself to stand tall. "His Grace isn't here." "Oh, I know, that's why I'm here." The stranger smiled, and it was the most frightening thing Charlotte had ever seen. "You see, Ashford has been very difficult to reach lately. Very protected. So we thought we'd try a different approach." Understanding crashed over Charlotte like ice water. This was one of them, one of Alexander's enemies, one of the people he'd warned her about. "Get out," Charlotte said, proud of how steady her voice was. "Get out of this house immediately, or You'll what?" The stranger took a step closer. "Scream! There's no one to hear you. All your servants are locked in the wine cellar, and your husband is currently halfway to London chasing a false lead." Another step. "It's just you and me, Your Grace. So why don't we have a civilized conversation?" Charlotte's mind raced. She could run, but where? He was between her and the door. She could scream, but he'd said there was no one to hear. She could fight, but he was larger, stronger, and probably armed. So she did the only thing she could think of. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met his eyes with all the courage she could muster. "What do you want?" The stranger's smile widened. "Now that's more like it. What I want, Your Grace, is very simple. I want your husband to understand that he can't just walk away from his obligations, that there are consequences for betrayal." "He hasn't betrayed anyone," Charlotte said, even though she had no idea if that was true. "Hasn't he? He worked for us for years. Gathered information, passed intelligence, helped us build something beautiful. And then when the war started turning, when his precious crown asked him to choose sides, he didn't hesitate." The stranger's voice had gone sharp with anger. "He turned on us, gave up our names, our operations, everything, got good men killed, and for what? For England? For honor?" He spat the last word like a curse. "Your husband is a traitor, Your Grace, and traitors need to be punished." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "You're going to kill him." "Eventually. But first we're going to hurt him. We're going to take away everything he cares about, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but pain." The stranger was right in front of her now, close enough that Charlotte could smell the expensive cologne and the ugliness beneath it. "And we're going to start," he said softly, reaching out toward her face. "With you." Charlotte didn't think. She just acted. Her hand shot out and grabbed the decorative vase from the side table, heavy crystal that had probably cost more than her father's house, and swung it with all her strength at the stranger's head. It connected with a sickening crack. The stranger staggered backward, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, his expression shifting from smug to furious. "You little bitch!" Charlotte ran. She bolted for the stairs, her skirts tangled around her legs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would burst. Behind her, she heard the stranger's roar of rage, the heavy thud of his boots on marble as he gave chase. She made it halfway up the staircase before he caught her. His hand locked around her ankle and pulled hard. Charlotte screamed and went down, hitting the stairs hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. "Nowhere to run now," the stranger snarled, hauling himself up the stairs toward her. Charlotte kicked at him with her free foot, catching him in the shoulder. He grunted but didn't let go, his grip tightening until Charlotte was certain he'd snap her ankle like kindling. "Let go of her." The voice came from below, cold and deadly as winter. Both Charlotte and the stranger froze. Alexander stood at the base of the stairs, and he looked like the Duke of Shadows brought to life. His face was utterly emotionless, but his eyes, God, his eyes were murder-given form. "Let go of her." Each word was precise, controlled, more terrifying than any scream could have been. The stranger laughed, though it sounded forced. "Ashford, got my message, did you?" "I got it. I was on my way back when one of my footmen managed to escape your little trap and alerted me." Alexander started up the stairs, moving with the slow precision of a predator stalking prey. "Now I'm going to ask you one more time, Marcel. Let go of my wife." Marcel's grip tightened on Charlotte's ankle, making her gasp in pain. "Or what? You'll kill me? In front of your precious bride?" "If necessary." The words were simple, factual, and Charlotte believed them absolutely. "I don't think you will," Marcel said, but there was uncertainty creeping into his voice now. "I don't think you have the stomach for it anymore, not since you went soft. Started playing hero for the crown." "Then you'd be wrong." Alexander reached the step where Charlotte lay sprawled, and without breaking eye contact with Marcel, he reached down and gently helped her up. "Go to your room, Charlotte," he said quietly. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I come for you." "Alexander, now, Charlotte." The command in his voice was absolute. Charlotte didn't argue. She just gathered her torn skirts and ran the rest of the way up the stairs, not looking back. But before she reached her room, she heard Marcel scream, and then silence. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold them still. She'd locked the door as instructed, and now she waited. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Then a knock. 3 soft raps she recognized. "Charlotte, it's me. It's safe now. Please open the door." Charlotte's hands fumbled with the lock. The door swung open to reveal Alexander, and a sob of relief escaped her throat. He looked the same as he had downstairs. Not a hair out of place, not a drop of blood on his clothing. But his eyes looked ancient, haunted, filled with things Charlotte didn't have names for. "Is he—" Charlotte couldn't finish the question. "Alive," Alexander said. "Barely. My men are taking him somewhere he can't hurt anyone ever again." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, then just stood there staring at her as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "You hit him with a vase," he said. Charlotte let out a laugh that was half sob. "It was heavy. I thought it might—" She didn't get to finish because Alexander closed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. He held her so tightly Charlotte could barely breathe, but she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around him and held on just as hard, letting herself shake, letting herself feel all the terror she'd been holding back. "I'm sorry," Alexander said into her hair, his voice wrecked. "God, Charlotte, I'm so sorry. I should have been here. Should have had more men guarding you, should have anticipated—" "You came back," Charlotte interrupted. "You came back in time. That's what matters. He could have killed you, could have done worse, and it would have been my fault. All my fault." Charlotte pulled back just enough to look up at him. "Listen to me, Alexander. What happened wasn't your fault. You didn't put that man in this house. You didn't make him threaten me. I made enemies who wanted to hurt me badly enough to come after my wife. Alexander's voice cracked. I brought this danger into your life, into our home. I should have never— Don't you dare, Charlotte said fiercely. Don't you dare say you shouldn't have married me. Because if you hadn't, I'd be dead or worse. Remember? Those same people would have taken me from my father and done terrible things. But they didn't. Don't you dare, Charlotte said fiercely. Don't you dare say you shouldn't have married me. Because if you hadn't, I'd be dead or worse, remember? Those same people would have taken me from my father and done terrible things. But they didn't, because you protected me. Because you gave me your name and your home and your protection. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. What happened today was terrifying. But I'm alive. I'm safe. And that's because of you, Alexander. Not in spite of you. Alexander's eyes closed, and a shudder ran through his entire body. When he opened them again, they were wet. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered. When my footman told me Marcel was here, that he'd gotten past our defenses, I thought— His voice broke. I thought I'd come home to find you dead, or gone. And I realized that somewhere between our wedding and last night, you stopped being a responsibility and became— He stopped, jaw clenched, as if the words were too dangerous to say aloud. Became what? Charlotte prompted softly. Everything, Alexander breathed. You became everything. And then he was kissing her desperately, hungrily, as if he needed to convince himself she was real. Charlotte kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring everything she felt, all the terror and relief and the fierce, impossible thing growing in her chest that she wasn't quite ready to name, into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander pressed his forehead to hers. No more locked doors, he said. From now on, I sleep in your room. I keep you close. I don't let you out of my sight. Alexander, you can't possibly— I can, and I will. His hands framed her face with devastating gentleness. You're my wife, Charlotte, my duchess, my— He swallowed hard. My heart. And I will not lose you. Not to Marcel. Not to anyone. Charlotte's breath caught. Your heart? Alexander's smile was tremulous, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him. Yes, he said simply. My heart. I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. But Charlotte, when I thought you were in danger, when I thought I might lose you— He shook his head. I've faced death 100 times. I've walked into situations where I knew I might not walk out. And I've never been afraid, not once. But today I was terrified, because losing you would be worse than dying. Tears spilled down Charlotte's cheeks. Alexander, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I don't expect you to feel the same. I just needed you to know, needed you to understand why I'm going to be insufferable about your safety from now on. Charlotte laughed through her tears. You're already insufferable. Then I'll be more so. She pulled him down for another kiss, softer this time, sweeter. For the record, she whispered against his lips, you're my heart too. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you gave me a lock on my door. Maybe when you told me the truth about who you are. Maybe last night, when you held me like I was something precious. But somewhere along the way you stopped being the Duke of Shadows and became just Alexander, and I fell in love with him. Alexander went completely still. You love me. Yes, you impossible man. I love you. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night, brilliant and warm and so beautiful it hurt to look at. Say it again, he demanded. I love you. Again. I love you, Alexander. I love you. He lifted her off her feet and spun her in a circle, laughing, actually laughing, like a man who'd forgotten how and suddenly remembered. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with joy and something that looked like wonder. I love you too, he said. God help me, Charlotte, but I love you more than I thought possible, more than I knew I was capable of. And then there were no more words. Just the two of them, holding each other close, grateful to be alive and together and impossibly, wonderfully in love. 3 months later, Charlotte stood in the drawing room of Ashford Manor, receiving her first guests as Duchess. She'd been terrified when Alexander suggested hosting a small gathering, terrified that she'd embarrass him, say the wrong thing, use the wrong fork, commit some unforgivable social sin that would reflect poorly on the Ashford name. But Alexander had kissed her fears away and told her she was magnificent. And Mrs. Hartwell had helped her plan every detail until Charlotte felt almost confident. Almost. "Your Grace, the Countess of Pemberton has arrived," the butler announced. Charlotte took a deep breath, smoothed her gown, a stunning creation of sapphire silk that made her eyes look enormous, and moved forward to greet her guest. "Lady Pemberton, how lovely to see you." The Countess was a formidable woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a friend of Alexander's late mother, and Charlotte had been warned that her approval was crucial for Charlotte's acceptance in society. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton said, looking Charlotte up and down with undisguised assessment, "you're younger than I expected." "And you're exactly as formidable as everyone said," Charlotte replied, before she could stop herself. Lady Pemberton's eyebrows shot up, and then miraculously she laughed. "I like you," she declared. "You've got spine." "Good. Ashford needs someone with spine." Over the next hour, more guests arrived. Minor nobility mostly. Alexander had insisted on starting small. Charlotte greeted them all with growing confidence, making conversation about art and music, and carefully avoiding politics, despite her newfound fascination with the subject. She'd been studying. Reading the newspapers Alexander left in his study, asking him questions about the war and Parliament, and the complex web of alliances that governed their world. He'd been surprised at first, then delighted, spending hours explaining things her father had deemed too complicated for a woman's mind. Charlotte was learning that she had a good head for strategy, for seeing patterns and connections others missed. Alexander had started asking her opinion on matters he once would have kept entirely to himself. "You're a natural at this," Alexander murmured, appearing at her elbow with a glass of wine for each of them. "Look at you, charming the Countess into submission." Charlotte accepted the wine gratefully. "She's not so terrifying once you realize she just wants people to be honest with her. Most people are too afraid to be honest. Then most people are fools." Charlotte took a sip of wine and surveyed the room. "Though I admit I'm exhausted. How do you do this all the time?" "I don't. That's why I married someone who could do it for me." Charlotte elbowed him gently. "Liar. You married me because you're hopelessly in love with me." "That too," Alexander agreed, and the warmth in his voice made Charlotte's heart flutter even after 3 months of marriage. 3 months of learning each other, of heated arguments and passionate reconciliations, of waking up tangled together and falling asleep in each other's arms. 3 months of becoming partners in every sense of the word. Charlotte had taken to managing the household with an efficiency that surprised everyone, including herself. She'd reorganized the servants' schedules, improved their working conditions, and even convinced Alexander to increase their wages. She'd also started accompanying him to his estate meetings, offering suggestions that he actually listened to and often implemented. The Duchess of Ashford, it turned out, had a talent for administration and a mind for business that rivaled her husband's. "Your Grace?" Charlotte turned to find a young woman hovering nervously at her elbow. She recognized her as Miss Caroline Hartley, the daughter of a baronet and one of the season's debutantes. "Miss Hartley, how are you enjoying the gathering?" "Very much, Your Grace. I was hoping—" The girl hesitated, twisting her hands together. "I was hoping I might ask your advice." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "My advice?" "Yes. You see, there's a gentleman who's been calling on me, but my father disapproves because he's only a second son with no prospects. But he's kind and intelligent and—" She stopped, blushing furiously. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't burden you with this." "Nonsense," Charlotte said firmly, leading the girl to a quieter corner of the room. "Tell me everything." By the time Miss Hartley finished her story, Charlotte had a plan. It would require some careful maneuvering and possibly calling in a favor from Lady Pemberton, but she thought she could help. "Leave it with me," Charlotte said. "I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do." Miss Hartley's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Your Grace. Thank you so much." After the girl had gone, Alexander appeared again, shaking his head with amusement. "You're going to meddle, aren't you?" "It's not meddling. It's helping." "It's meddling. You're going to become one of those society women who manages everyone's lives." Charlotte lifted her chin. "And if I am?" Alexander's smile was soft, proud. "Then I pity anyone who gets in your way, because you're magnificent when you're determined." He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her temple, right there in front of all their guests. "I love you," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "I love you too," Charlotte whispered back. That night, after the guests had departed and Charlotte had shed her sapphire gown for a nightgown of soft white cotton, she found Alexander in their shared bedroom, staring into the fire. "What's wrong?" she asked, crossing to stand beside him. "Nothing's wrong." But his expression was troubled. Charlotte waited, knowing he'd tell her in his own time. Finally he spoke. "I received word today. The war is over. Napoleon has been defeated. England has won." Charlotte's heart leaped. "Alexander, that's wonderful. Why do you look so—" "The Crown has asked me to return to service. They want me to go to Vienna for the peace negotiations, to serve as an intelligence advisor." Understanding crashed over Charlotte like a wave. "You'd have to leave." "For 6 months, maybe longer." Alexander turned to face her, and his eyes were full of conflict. "I told them I'd think about it, that I needed to discuss it with my wife." Charlotte's chest felt tight. 6 months, half a year without him, after these 3 perfect months of learning to be married, of falling deeper in love with every passing day. But she could see the conflict in his face, the duty warring with desire. "Do you want to go?" she asked quietly. "Part of me does. The part that spent 8 years in service to the Crown. The part that feels like I owe them this after everything." "And the other part?" "The other part never wants to leave your side again." He cupped her face in his hands. "The other part remembers what it felt like to almost lose you and swears never to let you out of my sight." Charlotte covered his hands with hers. "Then take me with you." Alexander's eyes widened. "What?" "Take me with you. To Vienna. I can be useful there. You said yourself I have a head for strategy, and I won't let you do this alone. Charlotte, it could be dangerous. More dangerous than staying here while you're thousands of miles away worrying about me. More dangerous than being apart when we've only just learned how to be together." She stepped closer until they were nearly touching. "We're partners, Alexander, in everything, which means where you go, I go. If you serve the Crown, then so do I. Together." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, a smile broke across his face. "You're extraordinary," he said. "Do you know that? You may have mentioned it once or twice." He pulled her into his arms and held her close, his heart beating steady and strong against her cheek. "Vienna, then," he said. "Together." "Together," Charlotte agreed. And as Alexander carried her to bed and loved her with a tenderness that still made her breath catch, Charlotte thought about the girl she'd been just 3 months ago, frightened, powerless, resigned to a life she hadn't chosen, and she thought about the woman she'd become, the duchess who'd faced down an assassin, who'd learned to run a household and navigate society, who'd fallen in love with the most impossible man in England. That girl would never have imagined this, would never have believed that an arranged marriage to the Duke of Shadows could become the greatest love story she'd never dared to dream. But here she was, in the arms of the man she loved, planning adventures and facing the future without fear. Together. Vienna in winter was breathtakingly beautiful. Charlotte stood at the window of their apartments overlooking the Ringstrasse, watching snow fall like powdered diamonds over the city. Behind her, she could hear Alexander moving around the rooms, preparing for another day of negotiations. 6 weeks into their time in Vienna, and Charlotte had carved out her own role in the diplomatic dance. While Alexander advised on intelligence matters and strategic concerns, Charlotte had become something of a social force, hosting salons where diplomats and their wives mingled, gathering information through conversation and careful observation. It turned out that people told the Duchess of Ashford things they'd never tell her spy husband. They underestimated her, saw a pretty young woman and assumed she was decorative rather than dangerous. They were wrong. Charlotte had uncovered 3 plots against the negotiations, identified 2 double agents, and helped broker a crucial alliance between Austria and England, all through the careful application of charm, intelligence, and strategic gossip. Alexander was equal parts proud and terrified by what his wife had become. "You're going to give me grey hair," he told her last week after she'd casually mentioned preventing an assassination attempt. "You'll be distinguished," Charlotte had replied, kissing him until he forgot to be annoyed. Now as she watched the snow fall, Charlotte felt Alexander's arms wrap around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "How different everything is from 6 months ago. How if someone had told me then that I'd be in Vienna, working alongside my husband to secure peace for England, I would have thought they were mad. And now? Now it feels like exactly where I'm supposed to be." Alexander's arms tightened. "I love you." "I know." Charlotte turned in his embrace to face him. "I love you too. Even when you're being overprotective and insufferable." "I am not overprotective." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "You assigned me 3 bodyguards." "2," Alexander corrected. "The third one is just there to watch the other 2. "My point exactly." Alexander had the grace to look sheepish. "After what happened with Marcel—" "Who is currently rotting in an English prison," Charlotte interrupted, "along with his entire network, which you dismantled. I'm safe, Alexander." "You're never truly safe. Not as long as people know you're important to me." "Then I suppose we'll just have to be dangerous together." Alexander's smile was slow and wicked. "I do like the sound of that." He was leaning down to kiss her when a sharp knock interrupted them. "Your Grace, you have a visitor," came the butler's voice through the door. Alexander sighed and pulled away. "Tell them I'll be there in a moment." "It's not for you, Your Grace. It's for the Duchess." Charlotte and Alexander exchanged surprised glances. Charlotte had made many acquaintances in Vienna, but few would call at this early hour. "Send them to the drawing room," Charlotte called. "I'll be right there." 5 minutes later, Charlotte entered the drawing room to find a woman waiting, tall, elegant, with dark hair shot through with silver and eyes that looked oddly familiar. "Your Grace," the woman said, rising to curtsy. "Thank you for seeing me. My name is Lady Catherine Blackwood. I believe you know my son." Charlotte's mind raced. Blackwood. She knew that name. One of Alexander's colleagues in intelligence, though they'd never been formally introduced. "Lady Blackwood." "Of course. Please sit. How can I help you?" The older woman's smile was knowing. "Actually, Your Grace, I'm here to help you, or rather to offer you an opportunity." She reached into her reticule and produced a small leather folder, which she handed to Charlotte. "I've been watching you these past weeks, watching how you gather information, how you move through social circles collecting intelligence like a gardener collecting flowers. You have a rare gift, Your Grace, a talent that could be put to use in service of the crown." Charlotte opened the folder and felt her breath catch. Inside were documents, official documents, bearing the royal seal. "You're offering me a position," she said slowly, "as an intelligence operative." "Not quite. What I'm offering is a partnership, a new division within our intelligence network, focused specifically on gathering information through social channels. Women like us, Your Grace, who can move in circles closed to men, who can hear secrets whispered behind fans and in ladies' parlors." Lady Blackwood leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I'm offering you a chance to build something entirely new, to serve your country not in spite of being a woman, but because of it. And to work alongside your husband as true equals in every sense." Charlotte's heart was racing. This was impossible. Women didn't do this kind of work. Not officially, not with royal sanction. And yet, here it was. An offer, an opportunity, a choice. "I need to discuss this with Alexander," Charlotte said. "Of course. Take all the time you need, though I suspect he'll be less surprised than you think." After Lady Blackwood departed, Charlotte sat alone in the drawing room, staring at the documents in her hands. She'd come so far from the frightened girl who'd ridden to Ashford Manor in the rain. She'd learned to be a wife, a duchess, a partner. She'd discovered strengths she never knew she had. And now she was being offered a chance to use those strengths in service of something larger than herself. The door opened and Alexander appeared, his expression cautious. "Lady Blackwood found me in the hall," he said. Told me what she'd offered you. Did you know she was coming? I knew she was considering it. She asked my opinion last week. I told her it was entirely your decision. Charlotte looked up at him. What do you want me to do? Alexander crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. I want you to do whatever makes you happy. If that's returning to England and being the Duchess of Ashford in the traditional sense, hosting parties and managing estates and living a quiet life, then that's what we'll do. If it's this, building something new, taking risks, working in intelligence alongside me, then we'll do that instead. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I fell in love with you because you refused to be invisible, because you demanded to be seen as a full person with thoughts and opinions and agency. I won't take that away by telling you what to do now. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. I'm terrified. Good. That means you're smart enough to understand the risks. But I'm also excited. Is that wrong? Not wrong at all. Alexander's smile was fierce with pride. It's perfect. You're perfect. Charlotte looked down at the documents in her lap, then back up at her husband. Ask me why I love you, she said suddenly. Alexander blinked, surprised. Why do you love me? Because you're the only man I've ever met who sees me as an equal, who doesn't want to diminish me or cage me or keep me small and safe and decorative. You want me to be magnificent, even when it terrifies you. She cupped his face in her hands. So, yes, I want to do this. I want to build something new with Lady Blackwood. I want to serve the crown and work alongside you and be more than just a duchess in name. Alexander's eyes shone with something that looked suspiciously like tears. Then let's do it. Together. Always together, Charlotte agreed. And when Alexander kissed her, fierce and proud and full of love, Charlotte thought about the locked door that had started everything. The door she'd been given with the promise of safety. She'd unlocked it, stepped through it, and found not just a husband, but a partner, an equal, a love that demanded she be her fullest, brightest, most magnificent self. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford, partners in marriage, in love, and now in service to the crown. It was unconventional, dangerous, completely improper by society's standards. It was perfect. 5 years later, Charlotte stood in the study at Ashford Manor, reviewing intelligence reports with the same careful attention she'd once given to household menus. 5 years since her wedding. 5 years since she'd challenged the Duke of Shadows and discovered he had a heart beneath the ice. So much had changed. The war was over. Napoleon was defeated, and the intelligence network she'd built with Lady Blackwood had become one of the Crown's most valuable assets. But some things remained the same. Alexander still kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world, still held her close at night as if afraid she might disappear, still looked at her with eyes full of wonder when she said something particularly clever, and Charlotte still challenged him, still refused to be anything less than his equal, still made him laugh when he was being too serious and pulled him into bed when he worked too late. "You're brooding," Alexander said, appearing in the doorway with their daughter balanced on his hip. Emily was 3 years old, with Alexander's dark hair and Charlotte's warm brown eyes, and already she showed signs of inheriting both parents' stubborn streak. "Mama!" Emily reached for Charlotte, who took her with a laugh. "I'm not brooding. I'm thinking." "Same thing," Alexander said, kissing first his daughter's head and then his wife's mouth. "What about?" "About how 5 years ago I thought my life was ending, and instead, it was just beginning." Alexander's arms came around both of them, creating a circle of warmth and safety. "Best transaction I ever made," he said with a smile. Charlotte elbowed him. "I am not a transaction. No, you're my wife, my partner, my love, the mother of my child and the keeper of my heart." He pressed his forehead to hers while Emily giggled between them. "You're everything, Charlotte. You always have been, from the moment you walked into my study and refused to be diminished." Charlotte kissed him softly. "And you're mine. My impossible, wonderful, overprotective Duke." "Overprotective," Alexander muttered. "I am not—" "You hired guards for Emily's nursery." "She's 3, and you never know who might—" Charlotte silenced him with another kiss, longer this time, until Emily complained and they broke apart laughing. This was her life now, love and partnership and purpose, a daughter who would grow up knowing she could be anything, a husband who supported her ambitions even when they terrified him, an arranged marriage that had become the greatest love story she'd never dared to dream. Charlotte looked at Alexander, her duke, her partner, her heart, and smiled. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he replied, "always and forever." And in that moment, with her family in her arms and a future bright with possibility stretching before her, Charlotte Beaumont, no Charlotte Ashford, the Duchess who dared to challenge the Duke of Shadows, knew that she had everything she'd ever wanted, and so much more than she'd ever dreamed possible.